envisioned to take place. Okay, and then what the role of any successor to the commission, should there be one, would be. And so those are sort of the two parts of the change agenda that we're talking about. As we move through page 4, today is August 6th, and I think I've already talked about what we're doing today. All the other meetings are no longer upcoming. Those are ones that have been completed. And then I think we can also move through page 5 pretty quickly. This is just a recap of the different components of the landscape analysis. The one that we have not spent time in one of these calls on explicitly is the lessons learned from prior large-scale change efforts in and beyond education. There will be a section in the full landscape analysis on that plays back some of the findings. It's informed our work. It's just we didn't have enough time across these calls to spend time on it, but there will be several pages on that in the broader landscape analysis. And I think I've already covered page 6, the two parts of the change agenda. So I'm going to dive in and play back some of the feedback on the landscape analysis and the theory of change in just a second, but I just want to pause, particularly because I can't see the Zoom, to see if there are any questions, or Jackie, Paula, anything that you guys would add into this framing.
So Mark has a question. Why is the content copyrighted by BCG? Shouldn't this be openly licensed? I mean, just to clarify, we absolutely, I mean, the commission owns all of this. I mean, all of this that's written into the contract. So this is just part of they did it on BCG slides. I don't know, Lane, if you want to say anything, but we intend.
No, you're exactly right. That's just a copy paste. It's part of our slide template when we do things in our BCG format, and it just got copied over by mistake. So yeah, this is not. Yeah. This is owned by the commission. So. Yeah,
but absolutely, the landscape analysis done in conjunction with GTY is, you know, everybody completely open to everybody who wants it and more. And we're hoping that all of you are going to use your dissemination vehicles to get this information out. So, but that's an important question, though. So thanks for clarifying that, Mark.
Yep. The other thing, I don't know if this has come through as a question, but I can imagine it would be one. The landscape analysis long document, the 200 or so page PowerPoint, and then the accompanying materials around the relational map. We are making some final tweaks to those over the next week or two, and we'll have them, you know, certainly for broad sharing with the field around the time of the webinar in I think the 26th of September. If somebody has a particular interest to see the latest version prior to that, for any reason, if you need it, just reach out to Jackie and Paula or Kate and me, and we'd be happy to share it. You know, like I said, it will be more or less completely done in the next week or two. So I want to talk now about, we've included in this document on pages 9 through 11, the high-level takeaways from the landscape analysis, the framework that shows the kind of bridges the landscape analysis to the change agenda and theory of change, and then the summary of the theory of change on page 11. I'm not planning to go through those again, but I do want to summarize what's on page 8, just playing back what we've heard in our last call of this group and other sessions since. So there's a clear theme in our last discussion around equity, and we've aimed to really incorporate equity both into the summary documents and also into the deeper landscape analysis, and in some very specific ways. So not just the word equity, but we've gone back and had a series of conversations to make sure we're pulling in all of the equity related implications that we can in places where they fit. So that was a very important piece of feedback we took from the last discussion in this group. Secondly, there was, in the version of the theory of the change at the time of the last Zoom call, there was a piece around exemplars, and we've broadened that based on this discussion last time and a lot of great feedback from the partners and others to talk about implementation knowledge more holistically, about the real need in the field for there to be a better understanding of different entry points into this work and what might build on different entry points. So if your entry point is discipline, or if it's an explicit instruction program, or if it's workforce readiness and partnerships with the business community, what would be the next step to take? If you've done a school climate survey and you have a bunch of data, what do you actually do with it? And if there's a real need for implementation knowledge, and that's something that we've highlighted more in the theory of change and throughout the documents. We've added the category in the theory of change around tools and resources, which are not sufficient to move the field by themselves, but are an important component. We've provided more examples in the landscape narrative around issues related to local and state capacity for supporting change. And then the last point, which came out very strongly in the Partners Collaborative meeting, is we put in an emphasis in the broader landscape analysis narrative around the need and opportunity to support staff in schools who go beyond teachers and school leaders, who have important roles to play in contributing to youth development, including counselors and social workers. So those are not all of the changes that we've made, but it's some of the most important ones. And I'll pause here just for a second just to see if anybody has any reactions to this list, or if there's anything on page 9 to 11 that you see that you want to raise a question or comment about at this point.
You can type into the group chat, and then I can just call on you, or you can just jump in. Okay, I think you can keep going, Lane.
Okay, great. And thank you to everybody who's provided feedback on these materials along the way. So the next section, we'll get into talking about the proposed coalition successor to the National Commission. I'll start, and I think many in this group have heard this presentation before, so I'll be relatively brief on pages 13 to 15, and then talk a little bit about what we've heard in our conversations with funders kind of one-on-one. So first of all, page 13, there is a recommendation of a coalition to succeed the commission. And there's a real emphasis here on striking the right balance in building on and extending the commission's ability to be big tent, to bring actors in the field with multiple perspectives and kind of areas of focus into discussion, and while being big tent, to be purposeful and make meaningful contributions towards achieving the theory of change. Not just being a group of people coming together to talk, but having a bias to action. And you can see that in a little more specificity in the benefits that are bulleted in the middle of page 13 around being a neutral space for diverse field leaders to inform each other's work and to collaborate together, to be an ongoing voice for the Commission's recommendations and guiding principles, to continue to build the movement, to build the big tent and build alignment with additional organizations, movements, funders, and leaders. There's a real sense that the Commission's done some things that have been very productive along those lines, but there's more work to be done. And then there's a recognition, a fairly practical recognition in the fourth bullet that, when you see successful convening entities like this, an ability to influence the flow of resources, but not control the flow of resources, that actually has some negative side effects, but the ability to influence the flow of resources does help to keep everyone coming to the table. So these are some of the benefits that a coalition would offer the field. Those benefits translate on page 14 into a set of functions. Some of them translate quite directly around owning the theory of change. Yeah?
Yeah, so let me I'm going to interrupt. So one of the questions is from Brad, and he's asking, is there an opportunity for additional case studies prior to the release of the final report? Building assets, reducing risk bar could be a great high school example. So that's one question. The second question, I'm going to give you these both now, and you can field them as you will. The second one is from Mark. It's, what's the opposite of a neutral space, just to make sure you're clear on what you are making sure this is not.
Yeah. So I'll take that question first. I think there are some different definitions of what a neutral space is. I would say fairly commonly the opposite is being defined as an actor in the field that has a specific frame that they support and or has programs. And programs could be curricula and explicit instruction programs, or they could be programs working with districts or states, but a programmatic entity is generally seen as not being able to be neutral in the way that is desired by most of the folks that we've engaged on this question.
So in terms of the other question, now I'm misunderstanding the notion of case study. Brad is referring to the commission's case studies, not in terms of the landscape analysis looking at field. We don't have funding for that case study, but we can talk about it. And I mean, it's a really good idea. Okay, but we can talk about it offline, Brad.
Okay, Jackie, are there any other questions that are coming through?
Nope, that's it.
Okay, so I mean, to finish up on page 14, I think most of these are fairly evident. The one that may be worth a little bit more of a call out is number 3, in that this is, as we look at the next page, a construct for collective impact, collaborative action, around a set of high priority topics. And the idea here is that you either have a topic where there's a lot of disparate activity in the field and there's a need for at least bringing the major players together to explore a collaborative strategy, or where there's an attempt to understand how they might influence each other and potentially take action together. And then there's another type that might fit into this category that's a more specific need or a more specific opportunity. So, for example, Stephanie will come on and talk about the taxonomy project in just a bit. There could be a working group organized around what are the right responses of the field to the taxonomy project? How might that inform what happens in terms of communication, in terms of aligning frames, in terms of other sorts of implications for the field. So you could imagine such kind of working groups to be construed either broadly around a topic or more narrowly around a fairly specific handful of objectives. But the idea is that they would be organized in areas of particularly strategic importance to the theory of change, where bringing field actors together, there's at least an idea that that could be substantially beneficial versus something where the major actions could be owned by individual entities in the field and advance that way. So this covers the functions, and then I'll move to the next page and talk a little bit about structure. I'll pause again. Jackie, any questions coming through?
Do we have any examples of collective action at the national level that is not primarily funded by a federal grant program?
Lane,
yeah.
Well, this is my question. It's Brad. I mean, I think it just, when we talked last time, that sort of like we're using the model of sort of collective impact, collective action that tends to be more place-based in nature, with a set of local funders driving And as we think about this at the national level, are there examples we can point to? Well, yeah, that's the rationale.
Yeah, and as part of this work, I was flipping back through the appendix, and unfortunately, I don't think we have the pages on it, but we have taken a look at past national commissions and their structures, and I think the one that Linda led starting a couple of decades ago is a good example of another national commission that had a life after its initial report and a structure for collaborative action. So that would be one example, and there are others. Karen Pittman has raised one from the youth development field that we profiled, and there are a handful of others in addition to, like you said, Brad, a lot of more place-based examples. I mean, though it has taken a bit of a different direction than what's being proposed here, to some degree, the America's Promise would be another example.
Thanks, Lane.
Everyone should feel completely free to jump in.
So I'll just talk for a couple more minutes and then open it up for discussion a bit more. So when we look at the structure that's put forward on page 15, there's a couple things worth calling out. So one, there's a structure where there's an envisioned coalition board that guides the overall coalition. This coalition would have a substantial representation of both implementing partners and educators and practitioners, a bit more of an implementation tilt as compared to the current commission, but also would have representation of many of the constituencies that have been represented either on the commission or in the broader set of bodies that have been pulled together for the commission to date. The other couple of features of this page, so you can see on here, the boxes that have the blue shading, the dark blue shading, are advisory in nature, and these are organizations that are envisioned, the Funder Collaborative, the Youth Ambassadors, Communications Collaborative, Implementation Collaborative, groups with whom ongoing bidirectional communication and dialogue would be beneficial for the steering of the overall coalition. And then the work groups, which, these five here are examples, and the white shaded boxes at the bottom would be more, like I described a few minutes ago, purpose built, composition customized to the specific topic area, time bound with specific objectives. And so it's sort of two different modes of engagement, one more advisory and one more focused on collective action or a group of actors informing each other in their individual actions. And of course, all this would require the support of the staff to help facilitate and drive the work. The next page on page 16. So we are in the midst of doing a set of one-on-one conversations with all of the funders of the commission. We're not done, but we've had 7 or 8 of those so far. In this page, we play back some of the things that we've heard. And so I'll kind of give a summary here and then pause. So, we've heard general support for a lot of what you've seen on the last 3 pages. In terms of functions, one place where we've heard some appetite for potentially pushing further is a set of things around knowledge exchange, and that's been framed a little bit differently, where maybe it's a set of common indicators for the overall sector, a way of actually measuring the sector's advancement over time, kind of builds off of our landscape analysis discussion. Others have framed it more around having a set of implementation standards or a way of describing what good implementation looks like. The columns to kind of moving rightward across the page, we have heard, I think, very universally the importance of diverse and representative leadership. There are some who provide feedback that the current leadership of the commission still has a castle kind of weight to it, at least in perception, that there's an interest in having a shift that's further representative of the diversity of the field. There's general momentum around a larger board, because there's a feeling that there would need to be a larger board to represent the full diversity of the coalition, while practically that would likely call for some sort of executive committee to help make decisions. The middle column around participation, it really builds on what I said earlier, that there is a sense that the commission has done a lot of things to build a big tent, but there are more steps to take that further. You can see some of the specific ideas there on the page. And then finally, as pertains to the host and staff, this idea of a neutral host has been universal. There have been somewhat different perspectives on what exactly that means and what that means in terms of what specific organization should be a host. And there have been some range of views about continuing with Aspen as a host specifically. And then the final point is that there has been, I think, a strong sense of a need to keep momentum, and that whatever sort of structure is needed and emerges, that a transition be managed in such a way that there's not a lull, there's not a gap, and that a go-forward coalition can really kind of hit the ground running to build off of the momentum that the commission has built in the release of the report from the nation late this year. So I'm going to pause here and just open it up for any discussion if there are either questions about what we've heard so far or additional ideas that you'd like to throw into the mix for others to react to. Would be great to hear those now.
So this is Brad. I mean, I have a couple of thoughts, Lane. One is, I wonder on page 16, now we talked about this, but just being explicit that given the national policy environment we're in, that this will need to be funded through philanthropic support. And that's not to say, you could say that about a lot of things, but here in particular, at the national level, I don't think there are other funding flows, federal funding flows that we could tap into. It's just, so I think just being explicit about that this is going to be a philanthropically supported entity for both good and for bad, I think is one. The second is, and now I'm having sat on a little bit, this focus on implementation, while I agree the work is going to need to focus on implementation going forward, I guess I wonder what role a national group should play in that. And I'd be that in particular, I'd love to get other people's perspective on, because again, on the one hand, that's where the work needs to move. I'm not sure a national group, how well positioned a national group will be to sort of lead that.
Yeah, Brad, just one comment on that. I would say we've heard very much a need to focus on implementation as the phase of the work, but not focus on implementing, as in this coalition is an implementing body. And that the idea is that by bringing together actors in the field who are implementers, who have different approaches, that you can, at minimum, have those implementers learn from each other, and potentially in selected areas find places where collective action makes sense and where implementers will opt into it. But I do think it's a really important point that it's not, we haven't heard from anybody, nor would we recommend from our own experience that this body should be a body that itself is implementing programs or policies or anything else.
Can we just be then more explicit about that in the documents?
Sure.
This is Jackie. So one of the other questions that has come up, Mark, do you want to jump in and ask it? Can you ask it?
Sure.
Well, yeah, that'd be great. 'Cause it's a good question. We've gotten it before.
Sure. This is Mark from Hewlett. You note on the slide that you're looking for leadership that's diverse and representative of the breadth of the field. And I was just curious if this diversity also includes different intellectual points of view about the work. So how do you avoid the groupthink? Do you intentionally have folks who disagree about paths forward, folks who might be a resident skeptic who questions like the pace or the approach or the things that are going to happen?
I think that's,
do you want to? Go ahead, Lane, and I'll jump in.
I was going to say, I think it's a good idea to at least to some degree, to have a diversity of opinions and perspectives for sure. Jackie, what were you going to add?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical. And one of the conversations, as you all know, that we've been having is related to the size of that board. And it became really clear as we moved through the process that in order to get the type of diversity that we needed, in order to get the type of diversity in perspectives, that we would have to have a little bit larger board than what was initially recommended by the group. So in my mind, I think what you're talking about, Mark, if you want to just clarify, is just those that are in adjacent fields that would be helpful to be on this board, as well as making sure that you have a range of frames represented on the governance structure. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways this is a field that's still growing. It's not altogether there, and so the danger would be if there's a small group of folks who think alike and instead of neglecting all the other perspectives that are out there.
Yeah.
Unless somebody else has, this is Brad again. I mean, I know I'm talking a lot, so I want to be cognizant. If there are other comments to make, I wanted to build on Mark's comment, but I want to pause and see if others wanted to jump in.
Yeah, actually, Jen Nandu, do you want to jump in and ask your question? I think it's another really good question. Can you guys
hear me?
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. It wasn't working before. So as I've shared with Lane directly, I think it's going to be fairly important. It builds off of Brad's comment to better articulate why we need certain types of work groups that seem like they are representing sort of ongoing work of the field. So if you look at sort of slide 15, there's a set of work groups that seem like they are like taxonomy that might represent ongoing or implementation knowledge that represent ongoing work in the field. And how do we sort of make the distinction about what a coalition is doing versus what is ongoing, and make it sort of remove what could be a potential for competition. So I think it speaks to Brad's point about role. I also have a question about sort of role and niche, and sort of what is the value add of a coalition, sort of what is it contributing that isn't going on in the field already, and can we find that niche? Because I think if it sort of looks like it has to cover all bases, it will either create competition or create a space of tension rather than sort of productivity.
Lane, do you want to go? Do you want to respond?
Yeah. I mean, I have one thought on that to share, and then there may be other thoughts that others have too. One of the things that we think is really important is that, and this is one of the reasons why we think it's important, that those who are leading implementation efforts be represented heavily in the board of this, because there are going to be places where absolutely there are individual organizations doing this work, and it's going to need to be a conversation about how a set of you know, if you have 8 different organizations that are doing important things around implementation knowledge, can you, you know, demonstrate the value of coming together and talking about what they're doing and looking for places where there might be collaboration opportunities? Because I think, you know, in a way, the work groups actually could be most valuable if they're in areas where there's ongoing work, as long as those who are doing the most important ongoing work invest in it. And so some of that's not going to be anything you can put on paper is going to say this is a good idea or a bad idea. It's, you actually have the most impactful and influential players in the field at the table, you know, in a real spirit of working together or not. And that's why having, you know, certain organizations involved from the start and invested in this overall coalition is going to be critical.
So this is Brad. I'll go ahead and jump in now on that. I mean, I just, Jen, to your comment, I think it's super important. Taxonomy might be an example where I think, you know, Stephanie would she may even be on this call. I think, you know, that like the taxonomy project, ultimately to be successful, you know, there's got to be uptake among a broader set of actors. And so it's possible that we could think about that as sort of like, you know, anchored on the taxonomy project, but really with representation from a number of organizations with, you know, that have, you know, frameworks in one form or another, that that their sort of, you know, genuine buy-in for the taxonomy is what's going to bring it to life. But then I just want to make a couple of other quick points on this, I guess. I was thinking go ahead. Somebody else is going to talk. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I think that was that Mark?
Oh, so hi, it's Stephanie. I think I was going to say something and I unmuted myself, and so I probably sounded like I was going to say something, and then I muted myself again. So I just wanted to say something quickly in response to Brad's comment, which is I think what you just described about the taxonomy project is exactly right, which is for it to be successful, it demands participation from a broad array of actors in the field. And without that, it by definition only represents a corner of it, or, you know, a selected few perspectives. And so it's a good example of something that just by virtue of its nature requires all of these different perspectives to get involved and participate, respond, and think about it. So in that way, it's it only lives if it has a diversity of perspective in it.
And I think this is Jackie. I think that it's a good content area to kind of think about on the difference between the importance of being an organization that helps to build momentum in the field and collaborate and facilitate, as opposed to compete, because there are other taxonomy projects going on right now. So just to be completely transparent, so Castle is working on some really interesting work as well. And so the challenge would be, you know, well, we don't want to duplicate what the Castle work that is going on, and obviously Castle needs to continue to do that work for their own organization. But what this would represent is bringing that work into the fold, along with many other groups that are working on taxonomies, in a way to facilitate the work overall and ideally bring some alignment. Steph, do you want to chat about that for a second? And then, and then can you guys unmute Zoe, because Zoe's been trying to jump in too. All right, go ahead, Steph.
Well, I mean, I think one early outcome of the taxonomy project as it has lived so far, which is probably about 3 years of life in this project and sort of figuring out how to do it and to build the tools that would enable it to do what it's designed to do. One early outcome is that one early outcome from conversations with framework developers like Castle has been an interest and a movement toward updating, revising, elaborating, making more detailed existing frameworks. So what, I don't know exactly what the Castle project is about, but I think from what I understand, it may be an effort to broaden and deepen the existing Castle framework. And an early conversation with Roger about our coding of the Castle framework back at the beginning was really fruitful in thinking about, okay, so where is there lots of depth here, and where are the places that we would identify as focusing in areas that Castle really didn't think they had included. So I think that there's real power there, and so bringing these efforts together may make them more efficient, more impactful, more useful.
Zoe, do you want to jump in?
Hi.
Thanks, Beth.
Yeah, and first, thank you to the Aspen team for graciously putting me on mute while I lavate my salad without my phone on mute. I appreciate you saving me that embarrassment. And yeah, I mean, so we've sort of cycled a little bit away, but I wanted to go back to some of the things Lane was sharing in response to Jen and Brad's and Mark's point, as well as I think it's sort of related to what Stephanie was just saying about the example of what a taxonomy working group might do. I think there's a way to interpret implementation, that this entity would work on implementation that could mean, spreading something we already know works. And if that's what we're thinking, which I get a sense from this conversation, I think we're not saying that, but I'm raising it up because I want to test whether that's, and see if we can get some more precision in our agreements about kind of what we think is needed. I think if it was about that, then I do fear that that what we're proposing sort of plays the role that I think other strong organizations in the field already play. And I think it doesn't reflect where this field is, which is, there are still lots of things to work out, and they're most rich working them out at the intersection between different perspectives in the field, right? That's where I think this body could provide tremendous value. So just thinking about some of the work that we support in the field, imagining a place where folks who are advancing adolescent development and that perspective with folks who are, looking really deeply at learning mindsets, with folks who are looking at SEL, implementation in schools, like that, the richness of a conversation that I'm sure, with character perspectives and youth development work, like the richness of that conversation is where I think the value production is. And so how we ensure that what you guys are proposing really harnesses that richness, I'm just double clicking on. I think that's right. And I think just, I guess I'm using the analogy of, I think, another national effort that was a combination of philanthropically led and sort of federally advanced, that I think we can take the lessons from, and we've used in our conversations up to this point is, the Common Core. I think what I see the commission having, and for that, for better or for worse, I think what I've seen the commission as it looks today doing is really trying to build alignment, agreement on, and make the case for why broader aspects of young people's development are absolutely critical, why it's already being implementing, and how we could do more of that. And if if this coalition would just continue in that pattern, I think that's not as useful as if then, you know, what we need to get about doing and what I think happened in the work of the Common Core, as I understand it, is, you know, that coalition really turned to, okay, what are all the problems that we're running into as we try to collectively raise our standards for young people and give every young person access to those rigorous standards. And I think if, you know, in making that transition, this coalition could, you know, probably add a lot of value if it becomes really focused on, you know, what are the challenges versus, you know, where I think we've been more potentially in this conversation, which is up until this point in the 2.5 years of the commission around what are the opportunities. And to do that and to have people feel like this is not competing, it is truly adding value by helping them tackle challenges they couldn't tackle individually from the seat of their own organization. I think co-construction of these working groups and really kind of, you know, getting on our organizing pennies and getting out there and doing a different kind of organizing with field leaders about where this work could go next is going to be pretty crucial. And I think that's, you know, I think you're starting it by depicting this picture of a structure, but then I think the one-on-one conversations, not just with funders who obviously will need to believe in the direction in order to help it get going with resources, but, you know, as important or more important, with the people whose, you know, energy needs to come to the table, who need to feel like, you know, coordination and collaboration in these work groups would really add value for them. And so I'm interested in how you all think, like, in the process, the next steps, how do you get to that?
So, Lane, can I jump in, Lane? Because Lane?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So, that the point that Zoe's making about the work groups and how it really developing those work groups, I think would be an essential part of the next stage. So we have example work groups there, and when we develop these areas, they're more than placeholders, but they're definitely far from final. Like drafty is the best way to describe them. And so I think what would be an appropriate next stage to developing those work groups is to blow them out in terms of proposals, but even to start discussing those with all of you, so you can start determining if those are the right areas, and if not, which ones should go away and what they should be replaced by, or if we need 3 or 4 instead of 4 or 5. So I think that would be a really essential part of the next stage. But again, I don't want to say that, Lane, you can jump in because I don't want to overstate it, but they're more than placeholders, but we put that word example up there very deliberately.
That's right. I mean, we did do the thought experiment of saying, okay, well, let's say these are the work groups, what would be their 2019 priorities? And there's some beginning thoughts on that in the appendix. I think it's page 65, but it was, we did that to kind of pressure test the general idea of having work groups, rather than envisioning that as a final design or final decision.
So this is Brad. Can I mean, I know we've got what, a half hour left. Lane, I don't want to, I know you have more material to go through, both, I guess, Lane and Jackie. How are we doing for time?
No, ask your question. I think that's important. We've got Stephanie on hold here. Her husband's making her a gin and tonic. I'm getting ongoing text because she's on vacation and her kids are banging on the door trying to get her to run out to the beach. She's in Nova Scotia, so it might make sense if it's okay to let Stephanie spend 5 minutes and then we can come back to the other questions. Is everyone okay with that?
when you put it that way.
Yeah. Is that
So-
okay? Can we say?
Literally, if yeah. So Steph, why don't you jump in and give us your 5 minutes? Did you get your gin and tonic?
No, he's disappeared. We just
Oh my
arrived. So
goodness.
there's a
Okay.
little, I know. You think service, a little service here.
I
No,
know.
we'll come
Okay. Why don't you do your 5 minutes, then we'll go back to Brad.
Okay. So I don't know where we are in the slides, but the slide, there we go. So I think I started the same way the last time I was on the call with you, which is to say, I know that many of you have heard about this project before and you've seen some of these slides. These are slightly different ones. And what I want to communicate in my 5 minutes is just a kind of another meta view of what the project is supposed to do, and to show you a little closer what some of the visuals look like. So as you all know, the big idea here is to build a kind of Rosetta Stone for the field. And what's that? Well, it's like a translator. It's a way to build more coordinated communication among the diverse perspectives in our field. And I think one of the big challenges that arises over and over again is this one of, how do we make sure that we're communicating effectively across different ways of thinking and talking and valuing the parts of this field? And so this project is really about bringing those perspectives together, and it lives and is viable because it is rich with perspectives. So the big idea is to bring together and align work in this broad domain by showing and being able to see the areas where things align and where they are different. Our notion of our work in the taxonomy project is, I would say, two things. One is that we love doing this kind of work, and we want to look underneath and get really close to frameworks and the ideas that are represented by them and build this coordination and connection. That's one thing that we love to do. The other thing is that I think, in a sense, it's a service to the field, which builds our big capacity to navigate, to understand, and communicate in the field. This all demands a level of neutrality that I think is critical. So in our work, we have to live agnostic to brand and viewpoint, which means that we have to continue to grow the project, to bring different perspectives in, to share and talk about what we've learned and what we find, and to keep it as sort of this living entity. So if you go to the next slide, so in our view, the work aligns and advances the field by making it more effective. So if we can get a little precision around how we talk about things, we're going to be more effective, because we're going to be able to see the places where, for example, our findings actually overlap and aggregate to meta findings, to sort of big learnings in the field of research. We're going to be able to see where the actual work on the ground is similar and different. In this place, we're working on self-control. In this place, we're working on executive function. They're actually quite similar. And maybe we can align our efforts to keep the experiences for adults and kids parallel across time. We feel like something like this, a project like this, is really essential to increasing and expanding access to the viewpoints and the thinking of those in the field, and bringing in other perspectives that may not be represented and may feel that they don't have access to all of the learning, all of the experience that of those players who tend to be dominant in the field. Of course, coordination, I already spoke to that, and central to the whole thing, the foundation is really effective and clear communication and working together. So if you go to the next slide, you'll just see that, and I know some of you have seen these mock-ups before. This is from an early stage of the project where we coded all of these frameworks, and we kind of showed where different frameworks emphasize different things. And the big idea here is that you could just sort of show the overall emphasis of each framework according to these big, broad domains, which I'm happy to, at another time, explain exactly what goes into those. And it can give you a sense of which frameworks focus on what. So, for example, CASTLE has a relatively even focus across all 6 of these areas, some of which they didn't really see themselves as focusing on, but with our coding system, we illuminated this greater variability in what they were actually emphasizing in the words of their framework. But something like emotional intelligence, which really comes out of a kind of academic discipline and has been applied in practice, is in all the words and all the definitions, very emotions focused. In the practical work that is guided by that framework, I think there's a broader view, but it hasn't worked its way back into the words and the language of the framework itself. If you go to the next one, you see that you can mess with these data to show different things. So this one essentially weights each percentage in here by how many skills are in there and the depth with which they are defined. And this gives you a sense of the amount of detail that's in each framework, the amount of precision, how many layers, what is the level of definition that is provided for each individual skill, and so on. So here you can see, if you just look down 4 of them, the Connecticut State Standards include a lot of sub-skills in each of their broad domains, and they define them with great detail, which you would expect from a state standard system. Emotional intelligence, which focuses only on emotions, doesn't have as much detail even as the Connecticut State Standards in the emotion domain. So one thing that's really valuable about this is that it's kind of information that can be fed back to those who are developing and working with frameworks. It's also, especially with the richness that is brought in from the state standard systems, it serves as a well of data that can be used in service of what comes next. If you just go to the next slide, oops, not the next slide, but the one after that, just hold on for a second. Go back. One back. There we go. Okay, so before I get to the networks, I'll just, now one forward. We're looking at the one that has the lines connected to each other. There we go. So where do things align across frameworks? Where are things the same or different? This is really the most closely tied to that kind of jingle jangle stuff that we read about all the time. So this essentially is a tree for each framework that shows where things are the same and where things are different, and how closely tied together they are based on their definition. So the thicker the line, the more closely aligned the term is based on what is actually provided in the definition. So it's not the word, it's the definition. And you can see that self-management and self-control and character lab are actually quite similar. And self-management is somewhat similar to grit, but not synonymous with grit, as you sometimes see in the literature. So, important difference. Okay, if you go to the next one, this is where I was going with this idea of the richness that is afforded by the state standard systems, which are being built in many, 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 many states as we speak. So this is essentially a network map of terms from across frameworks. Each dot is like a skill that has been coded from a framework, and the colors of the dots align with different frameworks. And we have built an algorithm into this which shows how closely coded they are to each other, how close they match in terms of their definitions using our coding system. And you can apply a threshold to that algorithm. And when it's super strict, meaning we demand every definition be identical, all the dots look like they're arrayed all over the place and they're not clustered. As you loosen that threshold, you begin to see clumping of things, as you see in the picture in the lower right. If you just go to the next one, here you can see that there are interesting clusters of skills as coded by us, drawing from across frameworks that lump into different kinds of categories. This is kind of a superficial example that we made to show how you can use these data to begin to drill down and distill what's common across all the frameworks, and may actually represent a kind of consensus view. And then where are the areas that are really sitting outside the consensus view? And maybe we need to look really closely at those and see what they are and understand them better, and so on. So if you just go to the next slide. This is a close-up of 2 of these bubbles, and you can see that if you look at the dots, that each one is a different skill, and it could be described quite differently in the framework, but actually they clump together under these bigger ideas. If you just go to the next one. So many of you know this. This is what we kind of imagine to be the future. If you have this what platform, you can link it to a how, and then of course you can link it to measures, and all of that just brings together or builds a more effective cycle, linking what we know to what we do, and then what we think we've done through evaluation and understanding whether or not it works. If you go to the next one, I think that just shows that cycle that many of you have seen before. There we go. I don't know if you just hop to the next one. I think that's the last. Oh, no. 2 more. So what we're doing, one more. Yes, exactly. So what we're hoping to do in the next year is take the Explore SEL website, which will be live to people invited in September, and take it out in a selective and careful way to parts of the world. So we are doing kind of we're hoping to do a bunch of user profiling and user testing to feed back into the website and how it works and how it looks. And this includes interviewing people and generating user profiles. It includes conducting user testing. It includes mapping how users come in with a problem and navigate through, and then trying to understand what they come out with and how they feel about it. And then developing a kind of rollout plan. So in between the second and the third star, we revise, we rework, and then we develop a rollout plan and an embedded kind of learning cycle. So we understand how people come in and use it and then go out. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Steph. Are there any questions for the group? Okay, Steph, I'm assuming in your text here that Matt is your husband, not your son, who's mixing the gin and tonic.
Yeah.
Right, yeah,
Yep.
Okay. So hopefully you're going to move off into vacation land. I really appreciate you taking time today for us.
No problem.
Thank you.
I guess I'm going to get off. So everybody, have a good rest of your summer. Thanks.
Okay, great.
Bye.
Thank you, Steph. Okay.
All right. So Jackie, this is Lane here. How do you want to? Should we go back to where we were before? And I think Brad.
Yeah. Let me. Yeah. There are a couple of questions here. Who would like to jump in? Would Brad? Do you want to go back to your question?
If that's okay, if we've got time.
Yep, we do.
Okay, so I mean, just a couple of thoughts. One sort of builds on Mark's earlier point about different points of view. I think, you know, Jackie, I've said this before, but I just want to say it for the group to hear that, like, I feel like the commission feels a lot of pressure to put out consensus statements and to sort of like, you know, particularly for external audiences, to sort of emphasize how much we all agree on. And I think for external audiences, it is important. It's important to do that, to emphasize, despite the differences, that, you know, we agree on quite a lot, and that's important, particularly for an external audience that's not going to get into the nuance. But on the flip side, I do think, you know, there continue to be different schools of thought, points of view, that as we, you know, come to the final report, I think it's worth highlighting some of that and not to paper it over. And I think that there is a little bit of a risk there because of the desire to show a united front, for an external audience. So that's the first point. And it kind of gets to then the second point, which is, and I mentioned this to Lane, I wonder in this question of inclusiveness in terms of like, I know I've said this, that like, I think you guys have like, you have cast your net broad and, very broadly in order around engagement. It doesn't mean you've always been successful, because it's a really tough thing to do, particularly in a nascent field where there are lots of points of view. And I wonder, as we look for this follow-on support, is to sort of to do a pulse check in the next couple of months around the level of inclusivity within the commission itself. So I wonder if you've thought about or have done any sort of surveys that would sort of like, for those that have been members of various groups, doing that pulse check to see based on the work to date, how inclusive, how much have they felt have felt their voices have been heard, just to get, because I think that will help us to sort of like kind of put our finger on how successful the commission has been in terms of inclusiveness within the bounds of those that are already engaged. And then I think this sort of network analysis that I don't think we're going to talk about today, but that BCG has done some work on, that may also be informative about who should be at the table, or how much does the composition of the commission today line up with what the network analysis said? Because I've seen this play out sometimes where you kind of get different pictures. There's the way you think the world is organized and who are the central nodes in the network, and then there's the reality on the ground. So I think, I've talked with others to sort of say that for the successor organization, or for post-commission, this question of inclusivity and different schools of thought, how effective have we been to date, and what process would we use to ensure that that the representation is even more diverse going forward? And part of that, I think, is a pulse check of how successful we've been to date.
Mm-hmm. Lane, can I jump in?
Yes, go ahead.
Brett, yeah. So we used the landscape, we used analysis and Lane's 100 interviews to do the pulse check on the commission, and that's what's reflected in this analysis. We can certainly do more of that. I think that what came back through that analysis, and I can restate it, was that we've done a good job creating a big tent, but there are some real specific audiences where we have to do a better job in terms of the in terms of those groups that they were listed on the prior chart, but we talked about the civil rights groups, we talked about the ed reform groups, we also talked about the business community. I can't remember the other one that was up there, but those in my mind are the three ones that we have to do a better job at. In terms of the frames, what has come back and is that we need to do a better job being less SEL or castle centric, and to be more inclusive of other frames. And I think clearly one of those is soul. And I've gotten feedback. There's some feedback. Personally, I've gotten feedback on the character front, which I think that's completely legitimate. So so that's my analysis of the data. And there's a lot of data that's reflected in the landscape analysis, as well as people generally tend to not hesitate to give me feedback, which is a good thing. So so if you're thinking, I don't know if you're thinking of something quantitative, Brad, it would help me kind of understand what you're envisioning.
I think it's more quantitative that I appreciate. It's always, BCG has done a ton of interviews, and that's super helpful, and I think that gives you a qualitative sense. I I think people are not, I mean, there are limitations to surveys, but like some sort of pulse survey of a sorts, over the next couple months would be helpful to complement the interviews, because the reality is people may or may not be as truthful in interviewing. Sometimes, I think a survey gives them a more anonymous way to sort of share. And it would just be helpful to kind of see systematically across the different, like the Commission of Distinguished Scientists, of Distinguished Educators, et cetera, sort of like how, generally have people felt. Because I know, and Jackie, you've heard me say this to you, that you're always going to have some pushback, that some people are going to feel like that, their voices weren't heard. You can't, there's just so many people you're trying to engage. That's the nature of the beast. But I think this would just be a good, more systematic way to kind of get a pulse check and see how that might vary across different groups. Where, I think some groups, my sense is, have sort of, that a couple people have sort of held the pen in terms of writing the recommendations. And I've even talked to people and some people who feel like they weren't as involved. They don't feel negative. They just don't feel like they were all that involved, that they recognize a couple people kind of took point to sort of drive things forward, but they don't feel strongly enough one way or the other. They generally agree with what's being said, but they don't have the same kind of buy-in because they weren't directly involved. And it's just a good sort of, process, process practice on an ongoing basis to really do that dipstick around this question of inclusivity.
Okay. All right.
This Will Miller. A survey can be really helpful if it's clear exactly what it is you're trying to assess. Perceptions of being included or not are different from buy-in, are different from do they agree with the recommendations. So there were a lot of things thrown out in that conversation. It would be helpful to get very clear about what the survey is trying to measure.
Jackie, I know we only have 8 minutes left. So, I think it would be trying to attack multiple things. I think how supportive are you of the recommendations is one domain. Another thread would be more sort of process oriented about to what extent do you feel included. I think you can tackle multiple questions, but Will, to your point, you've just got to be super clear about what you're trying to get at.
Well, and what action you take based on what you learn. Otherwise, it's just descriptive.
Sure. Yeah, but I think I would say for one, to be really concrete, there's been some discussion about the tent has been big, but it may need to get even bigger sort of as we move post-commission. And I think that, something like this would be a good pulse check for to what extent is that necessary?
Yeah, that'd be very helpful. I'm just encouraging us to figure out what are the survey questions that would shed light on an issue like that we're trying to take action on.
Yeah, that would be one example.
Okay, Lane, do you want to get through the rest of this last piece of your deck with the last 7 minutes that we have?
Are there any other questions that have come into you, Jackie? If not, I can give a quick flavor of what else is.
Yeah, I think let me just I just want to make one other provide one other piece of information that's not in this deck, but and we don't have time to have you all give me feedback now, but I know that if you could email me your feedback. So one of the most critical things that would happen along with determining, what those work groups would be, and the process for kind of working through that. The other piece is identifying the membership of those work groups. So I feel strongly that there's an opportunity to that you'd want you'd want membership on those work groups that would include those who have been most engaged from some of the existing advisory groups. There also would be board member representation on those groups because you'd want those groups to interlock. There'd be an interlocking director, so to speak, with the coalition board. And then critically, you'll see that there are different partners. Lead is not the best word, but there are some critical partners in the in any given space that would have to be on those work groups. So the process for developing those work groups, in my mind, as I think, from building from a business plan, what I would think the process would do, that I would go after is like going through proposals, separate individual analyses and proposals in each of those work group areas, and kind of blow that out and have conversations across those work groups. And then that would be rolled up into an overall business plan for the successor coalition. I mean, that to me it would be the strategic business planning process that I think would make the most sense. And it would require a fair amount of input from the Funders Collaborative in that first level of identifying those work group areas, as well as the membership in those areas. So I just want to put that out there. That's what I've been thinking about, and to be honest, I haven't spent tons of time thinking about that. But as I'm starting to develop a budget for this and think through what would support this work, those were my initial thoughts. So any feedback, and you can always call me as well. Sometimes it's easier just to have conversations with you all on the phone. Okay, so with that, go ahead, Lane.
Okay, well, given we just have a couple of minutes here, maybe I can just preview what's in the relational map materials, and then if there are folks that have questions about it, feel free to reach out offline. So Paula, if you can advance us to page 29 briefly, and then we'll go to page 30.
Okay. We're good.
So 29, when you have this deck to read, you can see the detailed methodology. But basically, we took every organization that was mentioned in the narrative version of the landscape analysis. We added all of the Partners Collaborative. We added all the organizations involved in the seed landscape that are associated with any commissioners, and all of the funders, either that are a funder of the commission or a funder that submitted data in our partnership with GTY to look at funding. We categorized based on a website search and kind of available public information. We used the partners and funders that organizations identified publicly to create relationships. And then we used the software tool called TouchGraph to put that into a network map. If you flip over to page 30, the things that you can see in this network map. So one is you can sort of see, not that different in terms of visually from what Stephanie was showing a few minutes ago, the cloud of organizations in the broad seed landscape and how they're connected to each other. And you can see, what organizations and what types of organizations tend to be at the center versus on the periphery versus not connected to the other organizations at all. You can look at individual actors and look at how they're connected. And then we did some analysis. If you go to sort of this third thing on page 30, we looked only at funders of these actors. And so basically, what was the frequency of mention of organizations by other organizations? So that's basically looking, we take away who everybody said were their own partners and funders. We just looked at organizations and how many times they showed up on somebody else's website as a partner or a funder. So really kind of three different views on this. We have a set of slides that walk through some of the initial findings. And then at the end of the deck, we've laid out a set of next steps. I think this is really kind of a beta version of this analysis. And there are several different ways you can take it forward. including adding additional data to it, additional data fields, doing some things with the methodology to tighten it up to make sure that we're getting data that organizations may provide if they're asked, but they don't provide on their website, so that we have a more complete data set, and also making sure that we have a more robust and representative set of organizations in the universe to start with. So just one last data point, if you flip over to page 31, our landscape analysis profiles captures 224, what we're calling here for, as shorthand, seed-focused actors. 105 of these were named by each other as partners or funders, and then an additional 803 organizations were generated. So the map that ultimately results has quite a number of organizations in it, but we know that there are still others that we missed, particularly organizations that are active at local, regional, and state levels. So it's a bit of a teaser, because that's sort of the methodology without what we found, but we'll be interested to share this with you, and if you have reactions, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay, any questions? It's 4:30. All right, so let me just check here on the chat here. Okay. Okay, yep, all right, some great comments about the work group and the survey. So the other thing that I'd like to just mention, I sent out this is just for the Funders Collaborative, and we have a mixed group, and I say that affectionately, we have a mixed group today. So at the suggestion of my friend Itai, he said, basically it's more appropriate to send out the documentation, the biannual report, which reflects actuals through June, to the Funders Collaborative, and then request that you contact me. I was just going to schedule the calls, but he reassured me that you would all let me know if you wanted to have an in-depth conversation about the financials. So I am absolutely open to those conversations. I will say that that the next stage of that budget is to really take a look at these work groups and to build that into a budget for the successor organization, so we can have a meaningful conversation about a successor coalition with the funding community. As Brad pointed out, this is fundamentally going to be supported by philanthropy. So that will be a critical part of those conversations, is having a detailed budget and at least a draft operational plan. So with that, is there any other closing remarks?
Jackie,
Yeah.
I would just say from my side, thanks to everybody on the call for your engagement and feedback along the way. It's definitely helped to make a better product and inform our work as we've gone along.
All right, thank you, everyone, and please email me, Funders Collaborative members, and I can set up calls to go through the budget. And any questions about the release, I included that in the cover note. And then we also will be seeing all of the Funders Collaborative members on September 5th for the commission meeting. We'd like to thank Grantmakers for Thriving Youth and for collaborating with us and BCG on the landscape analysis, and we're looking forward to sharing the results with the field with you on September 26th. All right, that's it. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.